Group Policy Objects Advanced Administration. In this nugget, we'll be discussing Group Policy Objects Advanced Administration, where we'll first of all start off by talking about templates. Templates are what provide kind of the skeletal structure for group policy objects, and they're what provide the options to us. There's an old way of working with those, and that's with the ADM files. That's what we'd use under 2000, 2003, and XP. And now in Vista in 2008, we use ADMX files as well, and we'll see why they are so much better. We also work with something called the Central Store, which is a much better way of working with these templates, and it's a much more efficient storage mechanism, and we'll see that as well. We'll take a look at modifying the scope of management. A couple of different ways of doing that. Actually, there's a few, but the ones we're concerned with are the block policy inheritance and enforced policies. These are two different ways of making exceptions to the normal scope of management, where policies flow down from, the site, domain, and organizational unit. Then we'll take a look also at security filtering. You might want a policy to apply to maybe only a specific individual user or security group, and we'll show you how to do that. Alright, here I am on a Windows Server 2003 server, and I've opened up the Group Policy Management console here. Now, as I've mentioned before, I normally like to edit policy for Windows Vista on a Vista machine or a Windows Server 2008 machine, because they're able to recognize all of those new policies, all those 800 new policies for Windows Vista. Whereas Windows Server 2003 is not really capable of seeing all of the same policies. In fact, if you switch back and forth between editing Windows Vista and Windows Server 2003, you'll run into some real consistency problems. For example, remember this unlinked policy that I created in our last video? Well, if I right-click on this one and choose Edit, everything looks the same initially, but if I go down to our administrative templates, gee, it looks like I'm missing a lot of settings right there, doesn't it? In fact, let me go ahead and take a look at our Windows Server our Windows Vista machine here. Actually, I created a shortcut to the GPMC out here. And if we take a look at that same exact policy here, and we edit it there, then what we see is in Windows Vista, editing the same exact policy, I got a whole bunch of additional stuff here that I don't have over here on the server. And that's because of a difference between the ADM files and the ADMX files. And these are template files that comprise all of the settings that are visible throughout here. Now, if I go to some other policy, one that was created, for example, perhaps on a Windows Server 2003 server, like redirected folders, I can right-click there to choose Edit, and now under these administrative templates, look, it looks more normal there, doesn't it? I see more of the same kind of settings that I would expect to see. Well, each one of these things really comes from an ADM file. For example, I'm just going at random here, but if I go to Control Panel and let's say Display, and this thing where it says Hide the Screensaver tab, okay, that appears out of the midst of a ADM file. And if I double click on it, this not configured, enabled, disabled, the explain text, all of those things actually appear as part of a file. Let's go ahead and take a look at what those kinds of files are as I explore my computer. And as I get into this, we'll go down to our system drive and the Windows directory, and I'm going to go down here to System32, or rather, excuse me, sysvol, and then the domain, and then the policies, and then down within this, we see a whole bunch of different GUIDs. Now, first of all, let me make this a little easier to read by going over here. Now, first of all, what are all those, and which one happens to be the redirected folders, and which one happens to be the unlinked policy, and so forth? Well, here's how you can find that information out. If I go to my group policy objects here, and I go to, say, my redirected folders item, over here on the right I see a details tab where it identifies this by GUID, and I just usually look at the last few numbers there. Let's see, 502A8, and then I'll go over here to look at the name of these folders, and whichever one matches that will be that particular policy. So there's my 502A8, and this folder here will happen to be the actual policy in the sysvol that corresponds to that particular policy, the redirected folders policy. Now let's take a look at something else important here. If I right-click on it and choose Properties, we see that it's about 3.5 megabytes. Sometimes, especially if you have additional templates that you've custom configured there to add additional settings, and that certainly is a possibility, then this can go beyond about 4 megabytes. So this certainly does add up. And if we take a look at this, look at these ADM files. All these ADM files, and some of these are a little bit on the larger size, well, they add up. Now, normally that doesn't seem like too big a deal, right? Let me close this up now. It doesn't normally seem like too big a deal because, after all, we've got an abundance of storage space nowadays. I mean, I just bought a 3 terabyte RAID array that, you know, a few years ago would have seemed huge and prohibitively expensive. But I just bought it for a song. I mean, the storage doesn't cost that much. So the initial thinking is, well, it's only 4 megabytes. What's the big deal? Even if you have a whole bunch of policies, it's not going to add up to that much. But in reality, it can. And the reason why is because the sysvol is a directory that's replicated between all domain controllers. And that's that folder structure I just showed you. So it replicates you know, your scripts that are in there, any of your group policy items that are in there. And since they all tag along ADM files, there's a copy of the ADM files for each one of those policies. That can add up. In fact, I just got back from a large educational institution on the West Coast, and I trained them for quite a few things for several weeks here. And they had one department that has over 2 gigabytes worth of data in the sysvol, and it's because they have hundreds of group policy objects. Now, the sysvol really just was not designed to replicate something that heavy. I mean, it does okay, and so far they haven't had any problems. But it's just that it wasn't designed to be that way, and it's inefficient. I mean, with every individual policy that's created, the same exact templates are copied into each one of those folders. Well, that's unnecessarily repetitious. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the failings of our traditional ADM files and our new ADMX files. And that's what we're really addressing here, is those template files that I just showed you that end in .adm. There's another thing with that as well. They're language dependent. So if I'm going to support multiple languages, not only do I have to have an ADM file to support my entire policy there, but I have to have multiple copies, one for each language. And then it gets to be pretty big. And that's another reason why this university has issues, because they also have a few languages that they have to support, to my understanding. So there's inefficient storage there, and you have to double up on your ADM files for each individual policy, and they're unnecessarily copied. And also, you can run into some inconsistencies. There's a replication problem between domain controllers, especially when you have that much to replicate between them. You just increase the chances of an inconsistency or an incomplete replication between them, and so you can run into some issues there. This really becomes even more of a highlighted issue, as we saw, when you do start to transition over to Windows Vista and the new ADMX files. Because remember, if I switched back over to my Windows Server 2003 machine, I might not even be able to see all of the available policies, and I can run into some problems there. Now, with Windows Vista, it's taken all of the settings from these old ADM files, and it's ported them all over. You don't miss anything here. They're all ported over to a new ADMX format, and these are language independent files. The ADMX files are. Then what we do is, if we have other languages that we want to support, then we can put into the sysvol additional files that are ADML files for each individual language. They're much more compact and efficient, and we get a much more efficient storage mechanism out of these, because all we have to do is to copy them from our Vista machine over to, say, our Windows Server 2003 domain controller, or if it's a Windows Server 2008 server, then it's already got those on those domain controllers, so we don't have to copy them. But all of the policies will then read out of what we call a central store. I guess I should write that in there. That's kind of an important item. Central store. I'll show you where that is and how you can create it if you don't already have one. So, for example, if you're in Windows Server 2003 and you have not yet created a central store, oops, I knew I misspelled something. Central store. So I'll show you how to create that shortly here. But regardless, because there's only one copy of the central store that appears on the domain controller, we now have consistency as well, because even though we replicate that to our other domain controllers, it's not like we have different copies of the ADM or ADMX files going back and forth between all our different domain controllers. It's one copy that appears in the central store that gets replicated to all the other domain controllers. Now, if I open up my Windows Vista file system here, and you can do this on any of your Vista machines, then I can go to Windows, and then I'll go to where is it? Policy definitions. Here it is. Policy definitions. And then notice here's my ADMX files. There's quite a few more of these. Of our ADM files, there's only a handful. But for ADMX, it's a little bit more broken up into separate individual ADMX files. That's okay. There's more files there, but overall, it's still going to be more compact and efficient. Okay, so it's really a pretty good deal in terms of its efficiency. And if you want to look at one, I guess we could do that too. You can right-click here and choose Open. These will, if you double-click on them, open up in Internet Explorer, but we're just going to go ahead and use Notepad, so I'm just going to search for Notepad here. and I'll open one up, and we can see that it's all XML tagged. So these are definitely XML files. That's the direction that Microsoft is heading for a great many things. In fact, here's a little bit of information you might not be aware of as a side note. If you take a look at the new files that are created by Office 2007, no longer do we have Microsoft Word documents that end in .doc, right? Now the default file name ending extension is docx. Well, guess what? Word documents are now actually XML based. You don't really see that, but that's actually what they are. So it's kind of cool that way, and Microsoft is going XML for everything because of common standardization with it, and they just happen to prefer it. But anyway, all of our settings then will appear here. So that's where these settings come from that we see in administrative templates. And then if I want to support the language, then notice this one, control panel display.admx. If I go to ENUS, which is English, US English, then if I go to this is my ADML file that corresponds to that other file that we just looked at, the ADMX file. So if I take a look at that one as well, all of this information is English information. Notice that you can pretty much read that pretty straightforward. This corresponds to variables that appear in the other file that we looked at that just kind of slip right in there and make it readable when we try to identify the different policies. Now what we want to do is we want to take all of these things. We want to just go up here. Let me go up a level. And one more here. We want to go to this policy definitions, and as we go into this folder, we want to take all of this stuff and we want to copy it over to a domain controller. Now, I've seen all kinds of elaborate methods for doing this. A good friend of mine, in fact, he's really sharp with group policy, but he created this whole command line command where you can X-copy all of these files over to some server. And he made it pretty complicated. There's also another guy out there who's really sharp with policy as well, and he's created some kind of a batch file or a script of some kind that also copies all these over, and it makes it really complicated. Well, guess what? It doesn't have to be that complicated. It's real simple. What you want to do is to take this whole policy definitions folder, and I'll just right-click and choose copy, and you just copy that to the sysvol over on the domain controller, and from that point forward, you don't have to worry about consistency with your ADMX files anymore, like we used to have to do with ADM files. And then when we edit any policies, it always goes to the policy definitions folder on the sysvol on our domain controller, and it reads them from there, so we don't have one version of ADM files like we used to, where we'd have potentially different versions of ADMs, and they would be inconsistent and would sometimes conflict with one another and so forth. Now we just have this item, and I'll just copy this, and I'm going to go to my server, whack whack DC nugget 1, and there's my sysvol, and then there's my domain, and then we're going to go down here to policies, and I'm going to go down in here, and I'm going to paste all of this information in. So I'm just going to right click here and choose paste, and now you can see that it's copying all of the files that we had, and it's copying them right over. So it's copying about 5 megabytes worth of data instead of 4 megabytes times the number of policies that we have, and it's now kind of a one-size-fits-all for our template files. Alright, now as you work with policies, you'll find that you have different requirements for different hierarchies and different levels within your organizational units. For example, here I've created another OU called Phoenix, and I put inside of it the Phoenix computers, and that's where my computer account is, and then Phoenix supervisors and Phoenix users. I also created a Tucson OU, but I won't be probably using that one much. Now what I want to show you here is that sometimes it's possible to create a policy, link it to a location, and then override that, or to block it, or to override it. So let's take a look here at what kind of things go on. Here I've got Vista Client 01, which just has no policies really enacted whatsoever right now, except for one small one which is not relative to our discussion. But we go to this Start orb, and we see a music item on the Start orb. Now if we click that open, and we see that we have our default sample music that Microsoft gives you when you buy Windows Vista. Now in some organizations, downloading music off the internet can get to be a real issue, and of course users can store it probably wherever they have right access or wherever they want to. But let's just say that in order to help mitigate the problem and make it less convenient for users to access downloaded music, we just want to take away this music at all, so that they don't even have the music folder. And how can we do that? Well, there is a policy that enables that. I've already created it here, and I'll just show you what it looks like. I'll right-click here to choose Edit, and I go to Administrative Templates, and then we'll go down to the Start menu, and we'll take a look at what we can remove. And then here we'll go down to Start menu and Taskbar here, But this is another peeve of mine, by the way. Notice that if especially if you get a big long list like this one, it gets difficult to find what you're looking for. Couldn't Microsoft have set this up to be automatically alphabetical? Although they didn't. You can make it alphabetical by clicking the column heading for setting, and now you can see that it's now been alphabetized, but otherwise it's kind of a hassle. But here I want to remove, and I think it's in here somewhere. There it is. Remove music from the start menu. And you see here that I've already enabled that. Okay, so we've got that going on. Now this policy is not going to have any effect right now because I haven't linked it to anything. But let's say it's a company-wide policy, so we drag it up to the domain and we want to apply it to the entire domain. And just for sake of context, by the way, I've removed all of our other policies that we've used in previous nuggets, and I've unlinked all of them to avoid any confusion or stacking policies. So now once we've done that, if we go back to our Vista Client 01, right now we still see that they have the music item. But if I want to remove that immediately, then I can refresh the policy or wait for the policy to refresh to happen, or I can do a GP update. By the way, I know of a large insurance company, I think it's the largest one in the United States, and they had a problem with users downloading music off the internet in the workplace, and they had a problem with one department in particular. Guess what? This is how seriously they took that. They fired the entire department over the music issue. How'd you like to lose your job because you downloaded the latest Coldplay album? Wow. So anyway, we'll exit out of this. And now we'll see that the music item is no longer available. Now I'm going to go ahead and log this user off for the time being. Now we might run into an issue here, however. Maybe somebody else down here, maybe the Phoenix supervisors, maybe these users, and there's only one user in there right now, but this user says, hey, you know what? I'm important. I am a supervisor. I ought to have the right to have music, and you're taking away my freedom of speech, so that's no good. So this person puts pressure on you, or maybe they take you to lunch. You know, you get a really nice, expensive lunch at McDonald's, and you succumb to the bribe. So what you could do is you could say, all right, I'll go ahead and allow you to have your music, and I will prevent that policy from applying. But I can't just delete this entire link because it does have to apply to these other users here and maybe any users I have under Tucson and so forth. So what we'll do here is we can right-click here and choose Block Inheritance. Okay, now you notice you get a visual cue there. There's an exclamation point that this user will not have that policy apply to them. Oops, going to the wrong location there. So we're going to go back to the Vista Client 01 and I'm going to log on as Phoenix Super 01. That's the Phoenix Supervisor account. I think I had the password right. There we go. And now this user is going to log on and we'll see that they will be able to have music on their start menu. And now then here I'm logged on as that user, that Phoenix Super 01. Notice that I do have music here, so I am able to listen to music while all of the other underlings and unwashed masses from within my company, they are not allowed to listen to music, or at least access the music folder. So we've been able to do that once again because we right-clicked here to choose Block Inheritance, which blocks any of the policies from further up from applying. Now, this can also have an unintended result because let's say I had 2 or 3 other policies up here linked at the domain level, or maybe even anything linked at the Phoenix level, which would flow down to all of these other users and computers as well. Well, now I've blocked all of them. So I might have 5 or 6 policies up here that I actually do want to apply, but none of those will now apply because you can't block individual policies. You can only block all policies. And the only exception to that is certain default domain policies will flow through no matter what, such as your password policy. But otherwise, now we have an issue here. So what could we do if we were really certain that as administrators, maybe a higher up administrator over here, decided that he or she really wanted this remove music policy to apply? Well, what they could do is to choose enforced, and notice that we get a padlock on that right now. So that even though someone down here chose to block inheritance, because of this enforced setting on the higher level up here, then it's going to push this down regardless. Okay, so you just need to be aware of the fact how you can make exceptions to the way policies apply besides their normal flow of inheritance. So now I go back to this item, and to this user, and if I do a quick GP update, then we'll see here in just a moment that even though I do have music right now, once GP update is done, refreshing, then I will no longer have music on the start orb. So now that policy has refreshed, and if I click on the start orb, yeah, sure enough, no more music up there, okay? So that's the way the policy works. You can block inheritance, or you can force a specific policy to apply regardless of any block inheritance further down the hierarchy. Now, just as a practical note, you should use both of these very sparingly because, again, it will make your troubleshooting much more convoluted later on if you run into problems. Alright, now here I've gone back and I've removed the enforced item from remove music, and I've also removed the block policy inheritance from the remove Phoenix supervisor here, so again I removed that item there as well. Now the default behavior now will be, once again, everybody gets remove music. So here I've logged on as a second supervisor account, that's Phoenix Super 02, you can see up here. That person does not have music on the start menu. Now what if I want to be even more granular in how I control this? What if I want one of the users in Phoenix Supervisors to receive the policy, but I do not want the other user to receive the policy? How can I do that? Well, what I can do is I can actually go to the link or the policy itself, it doesn't matter, and we'll see that by the security filtering item down here at the bottom of the scope tab, that this always applies to all authenticated users. That's the default behavior of policy. Now, if that's not my desired behavior, what I can do is to remove authenticated users. Are you sure you want to do this? Okay. And then I can add back in an individual user account. Maybe I only want this to apply to Phoenix User 02, or excuse me, Phoenix Supervisor. So Phoenix Super 02. Okay. And now it's only going to apply to that one user. So when I refresh policy, Phoenix Super 02 should have remove music, and they won't be able to see music on the start menu or the start orb. Phoenix Super 01 should be able to see it because this policy doesn't apply to them. It only applies to Phoenix Super 02. So let's go back over to our item, our computer, and I'm going to see that right now Phoenix Super 02 does not have the music item. And even if I refresh policy, we'll see that they still do not have that item. And now the policy has refreshed, and sure enough, they don't have music on the start menu. But now I'm going to go ahead and log off as this user, and I'm going to log on as Phoenix Super 01 instead. And we'll see that that user will indeed have music on the start menu. And the reason for that, once again, is because the policy does not apply to them. So Phoenix Super 01. And we'll see now when we log back on that because of the security filtering item that we did, that it only applies to that one user. Now, you can also do the same thing not only to an individual user, but also to a group, for example, if you want to do it that way. And that's normally going to be more efficient because typically for things like this, you'll have more than one user to which that desired behavior applies. And you'll just put all those users in one group and then set up the group as necessary in terms of the security filtering. And also, before I show you the music on the start menu, be aware that this is yet another thing that can really complicate your troubleshooting when you make all different kinds of exceptions, where you do want it to apply to this user but not to that user, and so forth. And sure enough, Phoenix Super 01 does have music on the start menu because, again, this policy that we configured only applies to this one user in this case. In this nugget, we took a look at Group Policy Objects, Advanced Administration, where we started off by talking about those templates. Remember, those templates are what primarily construct the administrative templates item that we see in the Group Policy Objects for both the user and the computer side. In the old days, we used ADM files, plain text files, but they had some inefficiencies and they take up a lot of space. Remember, the ADM files, all of them that are used, are stored individually with each policy that you create, whereas ADMX files are much more efficient XML-based files. They're stored in the central store in the sysvol of our domain controller, and they're stored one time for all policies, so we don't have to worry about consistency problems. We also talked about how to modify the scope of management so that we can block the scope of management so that it doesn't particularly apply to any given organizational unit. And then we also took a look at the enforced item there so that we can take a particular group policy and push it on through even if it's been blocked elsewhere in the scope of management. We also took a look here at security filtering so that we can force a policy to apply perhaps to only an individual user or a group. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.